Once upon a time, there was a young boy named Nadir, who was at that age where he wanted people to believe he was older than he actually was, but he still couldn't resist the pull of an afternoon spent skipping stones across the surface of the lake. One day, his parents gave him a small purse with the week's market money and a list of items to buy for dinner. Nadir, of course, had been to the market many times before with his mother, so many times that he knew the stalls by heart. He knew where to get the freshest figs, the juiciest apricots, the tastiest fish, the softest bread with the crunchiest crust. He even knew the vendors by name, and which ones, like Joachim, would slip him a handful of olives or grapes just because. But he'd never gone to the market by himself, and so to Nadir this was a big deal. His mother pulled him aside and said, "Grandmother is ill, and I can't leave her today. I need you to go to the market. I'm trusting you." She placed the coin purse in his hand. "You're almost a man, Nadir, and soon you'll join your father in the fields, and you'll understand just how much sweat it takes for all of us to eat. Don't lose this. It's all we have, and without it we'll go hungry. And your grandmother needs food to keep her strength up." And so Nadir set off to the market, daydreaming all along the way about he'd barter like he'd seen his father do, driving a hard bargain and coming home with an extra loaf of bread, maybe even some fruit for the family. Perhaps one of his favorite merchants would even slip him something extra, and he could enjoy his snack all his own before he returned home. He was growing up, after all, and he needed to eat. Everybody said so. After an hour of shopping, his market basket was full and his coin purse empty. He'd managed to stretch the coin a bit, but not as much as he'd hoped. He got an extra loaf of bread, bringing his haul to 5, and he'd even managed an extra fish. And the fruit merchant Joachim even slipped him one perfectly ripe plum. And the usually stingy Tobias, well, he'd handed him a small pouch of pistachios. And so, with his market treasures in hand, Nadir took the long way home, just to give him enough time to enjoy the spoils of a good market day. He decided to walk down by the waterside's rolling hills, where he could savor his plum and his pistachios in peace. Only when he got there, it was anything but quiet. There was a huge crowd, hundreds of people, thousands of them. How would he ever pick his way through, he wondered. Then Nadir spied a thin place in the crowd. It was near the shoreline, where only a handful of people, maybe a dozen, were standing and talking urgently. And he'd seen the looks on their faces before. It was the same look his mother and father got when they were counting out their coin and taking stock of the food left for the week. It was a look of panic and frustration, exhaustion, and hunger. And he knew from experience that when adults got this look, kids became invisible. He had almost slipped by them too, when he heard one of the men declare, Look, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. It's not a lot, but it's something." And with that, the man, without so much as asking, grabbed Nadir's market basket and took it to the man in charge. Too stunned and too small to protest, Nadir no longer felt like a young man, but like a helpless child. Powerless, he watched as his family's food was prayed over and broken into small pieces and handed out bit by bit to the thousands of strangers on the hillside. His mother was going to be furious. His father was going to be so disappointed, and his grandmother might not be able to keep her strength. And it was all his fault. So Nadir started to cry. He worried somewhere inside him that it made him look like a baby, but he couldn't help it. Big, hot tears welled up inside him. He would have to go home empty-handed, not a coin left, not a crust of bread, not a piece of fish. He couldn't even give him his pistachios and plum. His family would just assume he'd squandered all the money on little luxuries for himself. And so even when a man with rough fisherman hands set down a piece of fish and bread for him to eat, Nadir kept crying. He sobbed as he tasted his own food that was taken from his family, that was stolen from him, just a child. He cried angry tears on that seashore, even as the crowds began to disperse. What would he do? now that everything he had was taken from him. But then a shadow covered him, and a man knelt down beside him in the dirt. "Thank you, Nadir," the man said. The boy was shocked. It caught his attention, and he looked up at the man through swollen and red eyes. He was by all accounts an average man, dark hair, dark skin, brown eyes, and a beard, but when the man looked at the boy, Nadir felt like he was peering all the way down to the bottom of his soul. "Thank you," he repeated. "The 2 fish and the 5 loaves you gave us fed the multitudes gathered here today. We had nothing until you came along. You sort of saved the day." "Me?" Nadir replied, sniffing and wiping his nose with the back of his hands. "I don't understand it. It was only 2 fish and 5 loaves. How?" The man simply shrugged. "God knows." And Nadir couldn't tell if the man meant that God knew exactly how it happened or that no one could possibly know how it happened, and he began to suspect this strange man didn't really care to clarify. "I know how sad you were to give up the fish and the loaves," he said. "But I'm glad you stayed for the feast anyway. It would have been so much easier for you to leave. It is so lonely when you are sad while everyone else is happy. It took so much courage to stay," he continued. "But while you were weeping, I want you to know you provided for a feast that will be considered the greatest feast in all of history." "But you know what was missing?" he mused after a moment. "Something sweet, like plums and pistachios. I haven't had a treat like that in ages. Did you know they were my favorite thing to share with my friends when I was your age?" But before Nadir could even respond, this odd man set down a market basket. Only it wasn't Nadir's market basket. It was much larger, and it was filled to the brim with broken pieces of bread and fish. "This is one of 12 baskets of leftovers," the man said. "I hope you can carry it the rest of the way home, because it's much heavier than it was when you got here. No one will believe you, when you tell them the truth about how you managed. The truth is like that sometimes." And the man winked, and he began to laugh. He was right, of course. When Nadir got home, no one believed his story about the man and the multitudes and the miraculous feast. "No, really, Nadir, tell us, how did you get all this?" his mother asked. "You didn't beg for it in the marketplace, did you? You didn't steal it, did you?" And certainly everyone was surprised at how large this miraculous market day hall was. But they were even more puzzled that there wasn't a single loaf of bread or single fish that wasn't already broken into pieces. Nothing was whole, and everything was broken. "We'll never be able to eat all this before it goes bad," his mother finally said. "Nadir, go out to the neighbors. Go get your cousins and your friends. Invite them over so we can all share in this feast together." As he started to leave, Nadir snapped his fingers and turned on his heel. "That reminds me." Remembering the man's word about the missing pieces of the feast, Nadir went to his bedroom to retrieve his precious, perfectly ripe plum and his small pouch of pistachios. He'd squirreled them away when he got home, all for himself, but now he couldn't imagine not sharing them. To his eternal surprise and delight, though, instead of 1 plum, he found a dozen, sitting neatly by his bed. And his sack full of pistachios took 2 hands to lift. For years and years, his neighbors and his cousins and his friends would go on to tell the story about the inexplicable and unexpected day when Nadir had invited them to a strange feast of broken things.